In the heart of a bustling city, James, a 45-year-old CEO of a successful healthcare empire, finds himself driving through the misty morning with his sick daughter, Sophie, the feverish child clutching her stuffed fox whispers, a request that pierces his logical, business-driven mind. "I don't want to go to a big hospital. It's cold there. I want to go somewhere small where people are nice." Against his usual instincts, James listens to her driving to the humble Maple Light Community Health Center, a modest clinic that feels worlds apart from the high-powered world he's accustomed to. Little does he know this decision will change everything. As they enter, the soft jazz playing in the background and the warm, welcoming atmosphere offer a stark contrast to the sterile, impersonal places he usually frequents. But nothing could prepare him for the shock that awaits emerging from the clinic's hallway. Is Charlotte, the woman he once loved deeply, the woman he lost to time and ambition. For a brief moment their eyes meet. Years of silence hang in the air between them, and James is frozen. His heart pounds as the memories flood back. Charlotte, now a professional, doesn't recognize him as the man who walked away. Instead, she speaks to Sophie, her voice smooth and steady, as if the past never existed. In that quiet moment, James is left with a haunting realization. The woman who once loved him deeply is now caring for his daughter. How could the past come rushing back like this? Could he set everything aside to protect the good that still remains? The question lingers in the air, unanswered. The encounter was a collision of two worlds, one built on years of ambition and success, the other grounded in quiet, unspoken pain and resilience. James stood frozen in the waiting room of the Maple Light Community Health Center, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Charlotte emerge from the hallway. She was different now, of course, her white coat neatly pressed, her hair pulled back into a professional style, the folder in her hand tucked under her arm like it was just another part of her daily routine. But to James, she was the same woman who once looked at him with love in her eyes, a love that had long since been buried beneath the weight of years and choices neither of them had ever fully understood. For a moment, the world outside the clinic seemed to fade. The sounds of the soft jazz playing in the background, the ticking of the wall clock, the distant hum of the building. It all blurred as James's eyes locked onto Charlotte's. She too froze. A brief flicker of recognition passed through her eyes, a fleeting moment that neither of them had expected, but neither dared to acknowledge. There was no word of greeting, no surprise or joy in her expression. Her face remained composed, her eyes guarded, as if any sign of vulnerability would be too much to bear. She was the doctor now. He was just a father, desperate to care for his sick daughter. That was all that mattered. The past had no place in this moment. Not now. Charlotte gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging the decades of silence between them. But she didn't linger. Her professionalism took over as she turned to focus on Sophie, who had stirred slightly in James's arms. Her voice was calm, soothing as she crouched to Sophie's level, her tone that of a doctor, not a woman who had once shared everything with him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her demeanor, a perfect mask of competence and warmth. Sophie, still barely awake from the fever, whispered her name, and Charlotte smiled, continuing with her doctor-patient persona. James stood by watching as Charlotte lifted his daughter with ease, the same woman who had once been the center of his world, now effortlessly caring for his child. It felt like an out-of-body experience, seeing the woman he once loved now, in this new role, this new life. There was a strange sense of pride in the way Charlotte handled Sophie with such care, but also a deep, gnawing sadness. How had they ended up here? How had it all slipped away so easily, so quietly? For James, the silence between them was deafening. His mind raced back to the memories of their time together before the scholarship to London, before the pressures of his family's expectations, before everything had fallen apart. He remembered the long, deep conversations they'd had, the way Charlotte had always made him feel seen, heard, understood in ways no one else could. But the reality of their separation was too painful to ignore. She had left him without a word, without explanation, and for years he had blamed her for walking away. But now, standing here, seeing her again, he realized the truth. She hadn't left him because she stopped loving him. She had left because she had to. The words they had never spoken hung between them like a weight neither of them could bear to lift. Their brief exchange was nothing more than a professional transaction. James couldn't bring himself to ask her what had happened, nor could she ask him the same. The years of separation had turned their love into something fragile, something that could no longer withstand the lightest touch. They were strangers, now bound by a shared history that neither of them could fully understand. As Charlotte carried Sophie into the exam room, James remained in the waiting area, sitting on the edge of his seat. His fingers were laced tightly together, his gaze drawn to the mirror on the opposite wall. He stared at his reflection, older now, more weary, a man who had built an empire but had lost so much more in the process. He wasn't the same man who had once stood in front of Charlotte promising her a future they could build together. The years had chipped away at him, molded him into someone else entirely. 10 minutes passed and the door to the exam room finally opened. Charlotte stepped out, Sophie asleep in her arms, looking peaceful once more. "She's okay," Charlotte said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Just a viral fever. She'll be fine in a few days." It was professional, almost too professional. And James found himself nodding, swallowing the words that rose in his throat. Professional. James murmured, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't express. He reached out to take Sophie from her arms, but as his hands brushed Charlotte's shoulder, he froze. For a brief moment their eyes met again. It was a fleeting connection, a moment of unspoken understanding. And then just as quickly, it was gone. Charlotte didn't say anything more. She just nodded, turning away her back to him once again, the space between them growing larger with each step she took. James cradled Sophie, tucking the stuffed fox back into her arms, and moved toward the door. But as his hand touched the handle, Sophie murmured softly, her voice barely audible. "Daddy, do you know the nice nurse?" The words pierced through him, cutting straight to the heart of everything that had remained unspoken between him and Charlotte. James froze in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. Across the hall. Charlotte paused too, her back still turned but her shoulders stiffened. She had heard Sophie's words, she knew. And in that moment James knew too. This was the moment when everything would change. As he looked down at his daughter, brushing a hand gently over her hair, he whispered, barely holding himself together. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy knew her a long time ago." And with that the door closed behind them, leaving only silence in its wake. The past, for all its weight, was finally catching up with them, and neither of them knew how to handle it. James's fingers idly flipped through the pages of Sophie's drawing pad, his mind still tangled in the whirlwind of emotions that had swept through him at the clinic. The clinic, Charlotte. His heart tightened again, just thinking about it. The woman he had once loved, the woman whose memory had haunted him for years, had just been standing right in front of him, treating his daughter as if nothing had ever happened between them. His eyes landed on a particular page, one that was covered with crayon scribbles and bright colors, a typical child's drawing. But as he focused more, something caught his attention. At the center of the page was a woman in a white coat, her eyes large and kind, her hand gently resting on a small child's forehead. The child Sophie had clearly drawn herself. The woman, unmistakably, was Charlotte. And beneath the drawing were the words, "The nice nurse." "Her name is Charlotte." James froze. The air seemed to leave his lungs, and his hands trembled as they held the drawing. The colors, the care in the way. Sophie had captured Charlotte, the soft detail in her eyes. It all spoke volumes. This was no ordinary child's sketch. There was something about it that felt personal. Something that reflected an emotional connection James hadn't realized was forming between Charlotte and Sophie, even after such a brief encounter. The drawing felt like a punch to the gut. James stared at it, unable to look away. It was like a portal back to the past, pulling him into memories he thought he had buried deep. He could almost hear Charlotte's soft voice in his mind, could almost feel the warmth of her touch as she once held his hand. He had never thought about what his daughter might be feeling, how she might be processing the encounter between the two people who had once shared so much of their lives. But Sophie had captured it all in this simple, yet profoundly emotional drawing. His chest tightened as memories flooded his mind. He remembered Charlotte's kindness, her tenderness, her ability to listen when he needed someone to talk to. He remembered their long walks together under the fall leaves, the warmth of her smile that always made him feel at home. And he remembered the way everything had fallen apart between them. It had been so long ago, yet the ache of their lost love still lingered like a wound that had never fully healed. As James sat there staring at Sophie's drawing, he realized just how much he had missed Charlotte. Not just as the woman he had loved, but as a person who had shaped him in ways he never truly understood. She had always seen him not as the CEO or the heir to a powerful empire, but as a man who could be vulnerable, who could love and be loved in return. She had been the one who had encouraged him to dream, to believe in something more than just success, to think beyond the confines of his family's expectations. But that was before everything had changed. James couldn't stop staring at the picture. The soft round eyes Charlotte had drawn reminded him of the way she used to look at him, so full of love, of possibility, of trust. It was the same look that had once made him believe they could overcome any obstacle together. But over time, the pressure of family, of responsibility, of the relentless pursuit of success had eroded that love, leaving him with nothing but silence and regrets. And Charlotte, she had walked away silently, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. The drawing in front of him felt like a bridge, a connection between the past and the present, between two people who had once been inseparable but were now worlds apart. His daughter, with her innocent heart and open eyes, had somehow captured the essence of their relationship, even without fully understanding it. In that moment, James realized that the love they had shared was still alive, not just between him and Charlotte, but also in the way Sophie was beginning to understand the kind of person Charlotte had been. Sophie had no idea about the complexities of James and Charlotte's past. She only knew what she felt in that moment, a warmth, a kindness, and an undeniable connection with the nice nurse who had cared for her with such tenderness. And yet in drawing Charlotte, she had unknowingly captured the very heart of the story that James had never fully been able to put into words. It was a story of love, loss, regret, and now the quiet possibility of healing. James couldn't help but wonder, was this drawing, this small act of innocence, a sign that something could be rebuilt? Could their connection, long buried under years of silence and misunderstanding, be restored? His fingers brushed against the edges of the paper, feeling the weight of it, the weight of his own emotions, that had never truly left him. Charlotte's presence had never been fully erased from his life, and now seeing her captured in Sophie's drawing, he understood that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to bridge the gap between them. James sighed, his breath shaky. His daughter's drawing had opened a door he had long kept locked, a door to a future he had once dreamed of with Charlotte. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years he felt the stirring of hope, a hope that perhaps with time they could find their way back to each other. And as he sat there holding Sophie's drawing in his hands, he couldn't help but think that maybe it wasn't too late for second chances. James sat alone in his study, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. The drawing of Charlotte made by Sophie still sat on the desk before him, its colors and simplicity a stark contrast to the complexity of the emotions swirling inside him. As his gaze wandered, it fell upon the weathered leather notebook he had found earlier, the one that had slipped from his hands bearing a small photograph and an old letter from Charlotte. He hadn't realized how much time had passed since he had last opened it, and as he carefully turned the pages, memories came rushing back like a flood. The photograph that fell out was of Charlotte at 23, standing under a red maple tree on their university campus, smiling in the cream dress he had chosen for her birthday. Her face was radiant, her hair loose and free, a stark contrast to the tense, guarded woman he had seen just hours ago. James stared at the image for a long time, his fingers tracing the edges of the photo. A flood of memories engulfed him. How they had met, how the world had seemed so small back then, and how they had dreamed together of a future full of possibility. But those dreams had been shattered. His family's pressure, his own ambition, and a sense of duty had slowly eroded their bond. They had met in the university library, a chance encounter when James had dropped a book on psychosomatic medicine, and Charlotte had bent down to pick it up. Their eyes had met, and from that moment, they were inseparable. Study sessions turned into long walks and debates over their differing perspectives only seemed to draw them closer. James had never known love like that before. So deep, so consuming. Charlotte had a way of making him feel seen, understood. But as the years passed, James's responsibilities grew heavier. The weight of his family's expectations, the pressure to take over the family empire, and the looming scholarship to London, all pulled him away from Charlotte. It wasn't that. James's mind raced as he sat by Sophie's bedside watching his daughter's fever worsen. Her small body trembled, her breaths shallow and labored and her face flushed with the telltale signs of a viral infection. He could feel the weight of panic rising in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. His heart tightened as Sophie whimpered, her soft voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, it hurts." James reached for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the only number that made sense to him in that moment, the one person he knew could help when everything else seemed out of control. "Charlotte." He choked out, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's Sophie. She can't breathe properly. I don't know what to do. Please, I need your help." The silence on the other end of the line felt like an eternity, before Charlotte's calm, measured voice came through, steady and reassuring. "Stay calm, James. Sit her up, keep her head slightly tilted forward, and gently pat her back. I'm on my way, just stay with her. Don't panic." He followed her instructions, his hands trembling as he cradled Sophie in his arms, propping her up against his chest, trying his best to offer her comfort amidst his own fear. But he was helpless. He wasn't trained to handle these situations. He had always relied on logic and systems to solve his problems, but now, in the face of his daughter's pain, nothing seemed to make sense. It wasn't long before the doorbell rang, breaking the tension that had settled in the room. James rushed to open the door, his heart racing in his chest. And there she was, Charlotte. She stood in the doorway, a calm figure amidst the chaos, her face focused and unwavering, her medical bag in hand. No surprise in her eyes, no hesitation. She had simply arrived just as she always had when he had needed her, despite the years of silence between them. Without a word, she stepped inside, her presence immediately filling the room with a sense of stability and reassurance. James stepped aside to let her in, his emotions too overwhelming to put into words. He watched as Charlotte moved with practiced ease, her calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had taken over his own body. Charlotte didn't rush. She didn't make any grand gestures. Instead, she worked with quiet confidence. She went straight to Sophie, her gloved hands gentle as she checked the child's breathing. Her touch so tender it felt almost like a reassurance in itself. There was no panic in her movements, no haste, just a steady, methodical approach that put James at ease, even if just for a moment. "You're doing great," Sophie, Charlotte said softly, her voice calm and soothing as she administered the bronchodilator. "I'm here. You're going to be fine." James stood back, watching in awe as Charlotte worked. He had never truly appreciated the depth of her calmness, the way she could navigate through the most intense situations with such grace. In the past, when they had been together, he had been so consumed by his own ambitions that he had failed to recognize the strength in her presence, the steadiness she had always offered when everything else around them seemed to be falling apart. As Charlotte continued to care for Sophie, James couldn't help but think back to their shared past. He had been the one to walk away, the one who had put his career and family's expectations above everything else, including Charlotte. But now, as he watched her tend to his daughter with the same dedication and care she had once shown him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude that went beyond mere words. Charlotte wasn't just a skilled nurse. She was someone who had always known how to provide comfort, how to show up when it mattered most. For the first time, James realized how much he had taken her for granted. Her ability to remain calm and composed, her unwavering presence had been something he had never truly valued until now. He had been so caught up in the rush of life, in his endless pursuit of success, that he had missed the simple, profound impact Charlotte had on those around her. She had always been the one who held everything together, even when everything seemed to be unraveling. As Charlotte finished tending to Sophie, she stepped back, her expression soft but satisfied. "She's through it," she said, her voice still calm but with a hint of warmth. "Her breathing is back to normal. Just keep her comfortable and she'll be fine in a few days." James exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The relief that washed over him was immediate, But it was also mixed with a deep sense of awe. Charlotte had once been his anchor, and in this moment, she was again. The realization hit him hard. The true healing power of presence wasn't in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady support of someone who knew how to show up no matter the circumstances. As Charlotte stepped toward the door, ready to leave as quietly as she had come, James found himself at a loss for words. He wanted to say thank you, to say something more, but the words felt inadequate. How could he express his gratitude for the woman who had not only saved his daughter's life in that moment, but who had also quietly healed the wounds of their shared past? Before she could leave, James simply looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for being here." Charlotte paused, her eyes meeting his for the first time since their brief encounter at the clinic. There was no judgment, no anger in her gaze, just the quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through. "I've always been nearby, James," she replied softly, her words carrying a weight that neither of them could ignore. "You just never called." And with that, she walked out of the door, leaving James alone with his thoughts, a deeper appreciation for her than he had ever known before. The healing had begun, not just for Sophie, but for himself, for all the years of silence and regret. Sometimes the healing power of presence wasn't something you could ask for or demand. It was something that came when you needed it most, from the people who had always been there, waiting for the right moment to step back into your life. James sat in his office late that night, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. He had tried to bury the thoughts, to push them down beneath the surface, but they kept rising, like the tide, unavoidable, relentless. His daughter was safe now, her breathing steady and calm after Charlotte's timely intervention. But something deeper had shifted inside James. He had always been the one to solve problems with strategy, to use logic to guide every decision. But today, standing in that clinic, watching Charlotte care for Sophie with a quiet grace, he realized how much he had neglected to understand her, not just as a medical professional, but as the woman who had once loved him with everything she had. His eyes drifted over to the weathered leather notebook that still lay on his desk, the photograph of Charlotte, the letter from years ago. It all felt so distant, yet so painfully close. The mistakes, the lost time, the words never said. James's chest tightened as he recalled how he had walked away from Charlotte when she needed him most, blinded by ambition and the suffocating pressure from his family. He had chosen his career over love, his empire over the one person who had seen him, truly seen him for who he was, and now, standing in the space between them both, physically and emotionally, he understood the depth of his failure. The realization stung, but it also sparked something else in him, a desire to make things right, or at least to begin the process. He couldn't undo the years, couldn't go back and change the decisions he had made. But he could do something now. Something small. Something real. James stood up from his desk, the weight of his thoughts still heavy, but there was a new sense of purpose in his step. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he felt an overwhelming urge to do something, to act on the remorse that had been building up inside him for so long. Charlotte had always been the one to give without expecting anything in return, and perhaps now he could show her something she had never received from him: appreciation and acknowledgement. The next morning, when the clinic was closed, James found himself standing outside Maple Light Community Health Center. It was a quiet, almost serene morning, the sun just beginning to break through the mist that clung to the streets. There was no one around. The clinic still empty of patients, and staff seemed to wait for him, its worn exterior hiding the warmth within. Without hesitating, James unlocked the door with the key Charlotte had given him the night before. She had pressed it into his hand, a simple gesture that carried more weight than he had understood at the time. "Keep it if you know what you still owe," she had said. He didn't fully understand then. But as he stepped into the empty building, he realized what she meant. This wasn't about grand apologies or words that could never truly make up for the past. This was about showing up. Showing her that he was willing to do something without being asked. Something that spoke louder than words. He started with the waiting area, methodically straightening chairs, picking up stray pieces of paper, aligning the health brochures. It wasn't much, but he felt a strange sense of peace as he worked. Every movement seemed to pull him further from the man he had been, the man who had thought that success and status could fill the void left by love. As he scrubbed the surface of the counter, he found a small teacup stained with remnants of forgotten moments. James gently cleaned it, drying it with the care of someone who had learned finally the value of small acts of tenderness. He didn't stop there. He moved through the clinic with quiet determination, mopping the floors, wiping down surfaces, even dusting the shelves. The work felt cathartic, as if each motion was helping to cleanse a part of him that had been covered in layers of regret for too long. It was tedious, humble work, but it carried a meaning that transcended any corporate task he had ever faced. It was, in its own way, an apology, a silent recognition of everything he had failed to do in the past, a humble effort to show Charlotte that he understood now what he had once failed to see. When he finished, the clinic looked pristine, not just cleaned but cared for. He stepped back, wiping his brow, taking in the simple act of transformation. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about acknowledging that some things couldn't be fixed with words. Some things needed actions. And this, in his own small way, was the only thing he could offer to Charlotte, to the woman who had once loved him, and to the woman who had quietly changed his life once again. Before leaving, James took a moment to prepare something else. He had brought a small pouch of ginger tea from Charlotte's favorite corner shop, the one she used to visit during their time together. It seemed like such a small thing, but it was a gesture that felt right. He set the teacup on her desk next to the stethoscope she had forgotten the night before. Then on a small piece of paper he wrote a simple note. "Thank you for being there." No grand apologies, no elaborate promises. Just the acknowledgement that he had failed her in the past, but that he now understood the value of her presence in his life. He didn't expect anything in return, and he didn't want to force anything. This was his act of gratitude, his apology without words. As he left the clinic, locking the door behind him, James felt a sense of quiet resolve. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of the love and time they had shared, and a small but meaningful step toward healing. It was the kind of apology that didn't need to be spoken aloud, because it was already understood in the actions he had taken. He had made peace with the past, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward making things right. James stood in the soft glow of the early morning light, looking at the clinic's entrance, as if it had become a gateway to something he had long abandoned: hope. The air was still quiet, filled with the faint hum of a new day beginning. He had just left Charlotte's note and the small gesture of gratitude on her desk, but there was something deeper stirring within him. As he walked away from Maple Light Community Health Center, he realized that the act of cleaning, of returning to the place where they had once shared so much, was more than just a gesture. It was a step toward reconciliation, not just with Charlotte, but with himself. For so many years, James had believed that words could fix everything. He had thought that if he said the right things, if he apologized enough, Charlotte would forgive him and they could pick up where they had left off. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath of his actions, he understood that it wasn't the words that had the power to heal. It was the willingness to show up to do something meaningful without asking for anything in return. Charlotte had always been the one to give, without expecting anything back. And now, for the first time, James had given too. In the days that followed, the weight of James's actions began to settle into a quiet understanding between them. Charlotte didn't mention the cleaning, the tea, or the note. She didn't need to. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply a space where both of them had been forced to reflect on the years they had spent apart and the changes they had undergone. James noticed it in the way she moved, in the way she spoke to him, and in the way she treated Sophie. There was no grand declaration of forgiveness, but there didn't need to be. The change was subtle, like the gentle shift of seasons, but it was there. 1 week later, James returned to the clinic, this time with Sophie in tow. The familiarity of the place, the small wooden chairs in the waiting room, and the soft jazz playing in the background felt comforting, even as memories of the past lingered like shadows. Charlotte was at the desk sorting through some files, but when she saw James and Sophie, she smiled. Not the guarded smile of a professional, but one that held something more, something that spoke of time past and understanding, slowly emerging. "Hello," Sophie Charlotte greeted, crouching down to the little girl's level, her voice warm. "How are you today?" Sophie, always eager to share, smiled widely and ran up to her, holding up a drawing she had made just the day before. "I drew you again," Sophie said proudly, her wide eyes sparkling with innocence. Charlotte took the drawing with a soft chuckle, her fingers brushing over the crayon marks. It was a familiar scene, Sophie sitting in the clinic chair with Charlotte standing beside her smiling. But this time there was something new in the drawing, a small teacup beside them. The third cup. James's heart tightened as he realized what Sophie had captured. "Looks like I've got a fan," Charlotte said, her voice light with amusement as she looked at James, her gaze lingering just a little longer than usual. It was an acknowledgement of the time they had spent, a part of the unspoken understanding that had been slowly building between them. "No," Sophie corrected. "That's for my daddy. He cleaned the clinic and he brought you tea. He told me that sometimes you don't need to say sorry, because some things are too big for words." Charlotte's smile softened, and for a moment, there was an almost imperceptible pause. James stood back, watching the exchange. His chest tightened with the realization of what had just transpired, what his daughter had captured so innocently in her drawing. The teacup had become more than just a simple object. It had become a symbol of their shared past, the healing that was now taking place, and the quiet hope for the future. Later that day, Charlotte invited James to stay for a cup of tea. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a conversation about the past or forgiveness. It was just a quiet moment. Two people who had once loved each other now sitting across from each other, acknowledging the space between them, and perhaps the space they had begun to fill. Charlotte poured the tea into the 3 cups just as she had always done with James years ago. There was one for her, one for Sophie, and one for James. The third cup, now more than just a place setting, symbolized something deeper. The possibility of second chances of healing without words, of a future that wasn't defined by mistakes, but by the willingness to show up when it mattered most. As James sat there sipping his tea, he didn't know what the future held, or if their relationship would ever return to what it once was. But for the first time he felt a sense of peace. The past could never be erased, but it could be acknowledged, understood, and allowed to heal. And in that small, quiet moment, with Charlotte sitting across from him and Sophie playing nearby, James realized that sometimes forgiveness doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in the simplest of actions, the willingness to sit together, share a cup of tea, and let time do its quiet work. In that third cup of tea, James found a symbol of something more: hope for the future. The courage to forgive and the strength to embrace second chances. A week had passed since James's quiet gesture of reconciliation, and as he walked into Maple Light Community Health Center once again, the weight of the past no longer felt as heavy. The clinic, familiar and comforting, seemed to welcome him in a way it never had before. The hum of the quiet building, the faint scent of antiseptic mingling with the warmth of the tea that Charlotte had shared with him, was now a backdrop to something new. A new chapter. A new understanding. James felt it deep inside, this shift in his heart that had begun the moment he had stepped into the clinic with Sophie. Today, he wasn't just there to visit. Today, he was a part of something. Today he wasn't the businessman or the estranged lover. He was simply a father present in a moment of quiet healing. Charlotte had invited him and Sophie to come by, and as James sat in the small waiting area, his eyes fell upon the familiar teacup set on the counter. Charlotte had placed 3 cups there once again, one for herself, one for Sophie, and one for him. The third cup had become something symbolic in the last week, a symbol of everything that had been, everything that was, and everything that could be. As James's fingers gently brushed the edge of the teacup, he felt the weight of those 3 cups. They weren't just vessels for tea anymore. They had become markers in their shared history. Charlotte walked into the room with her usual calm presence, her steps measured and purposeful. She gave James a small, genuine smile as she approached. There was no tension between them now. No lingering awkwardness. The silence between them had morphed into something different, an understanding, a mutual respect that they hadn't had in years. She set down the teapot and poured the tea into the 3 cups. Her movements deliberate, each pour carrying more meaning than words could have. "Thank you for being here," Charlotte said softly, her voice warm but steady. She looked at Sophie, who was playing with a small toy on the floor, her cheeks flushed with the energy of youth. Charlotte's eyes softened as she looked at James. And in that moment, there was no need for further explanation, no need for grand gestures or apologies. The past had been acknowledged, and the present, was here alive and full of quiet possibilities. James sat quietly as Charlotte poured the tea, watching the steam rise from the cups. It was a simple moment, a peaceful one, but one that spoke volumes. In the past, they had been caught in a whirlwind of unspoken expectations of ambition and of love that had been pushed aside in favor of everything else. But now, as the three of them sat together in the calm of the clinic, James realized that some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. Presence, simply being there, was enough. He glanced at the 3 cups on the table, and Charlotte's quiet smile said more than any apology or explanation could. The first cup, the one for the past, was a reminder of their history, of everything they had been through. The second cup, the one for the present, was a reflection of who they were now. 2 people who had gone through pain, growth, and understanding. And the third cup, the one for the future, was filled with hope. Hope for what could be, hope for the new beginning they had both longed for but had been too afraid to reach for until now. Sophie, with her usual innocence, had already picked up the second cup and was eagerly sipping the tea, her small hands wrapped around the delicate porcelain. She was too young to fully understand the significance of the moment, but her presence was a reminder that life moved forward, that healing wasn't just about mending old wounds, but about finding new ways to live, to love, and to grow. James watched Charlotte as she sat beside him, her eyes not on him, but on Sophie, who was now asking about the artwork on the walls. Charlotte answered, her voice soft and tender, her patience a quiet testament to the care she had always given to others. James felt a deep sense of gratitude swell within him. Gratitude not just for the care Charlotte had shown Sophie, but for the care she had shown him in ways he had never fully understood. As they sat there together, the silence between them no longer felt heavy, but peaceful. Full of understanding, James knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that the road to healing wasn't simple or straight. But in this moment, he realized that the act of being present was healing in itself. Charlotte's actions, her steady presence, and her quiet strength had been enough to help him see that forgiveness wasn't always something you asked for. It was something you earned with time, patience, and presence. The 3 cups of tea now held a deeper meaning. They represented their shared past, their present healing, and their hopeful future. They had been through so much, but in this moment, there was hope. Hope that they could start anew. Hope that forgiveness didn't always require grand gestures, and hope that love, though sometimes tested, could always find its way back, even when it seemed lost. As James looked at Charlotte, and then at Sophie, he realized that the healing was already happening. Not in words or grand gestures, but in the quiet, simple acts of showing up and being there for one another. It was a new beginning, one that was full of promise and possibility. And for the first time in a long time, James felt at peace with the future that lay ahead. As James sat quietly with Charlotte and Sophie, the warmth of the moment seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the clinic, filling the space with a sense of calm and possibility. The past, with all its missteps and misunderstandings, no longer seemed to define their future. Instead, it was a part of their shared history, something they had lived through, learned from, and now something they had begun to heal. In the gentle presence of each other, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. Second chances were not just possible, they were happening. James, who had once been so driven by the need for success, the need to prove his worth through his career, now found himself in a place of quiet reflection. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pressure of needing to achieve or to be perfect. The weight of his ambitions no longer felt like a burden. Instead, he saw it as part of the journey that had led him back to Charlotte and to this moment with Sophie. He had learned that true fulfillment didn't come from accolades or accomplishments. It came from the relationships you nurtured, the love you gave, and the presence you offered to those who mattered most. Charlotte, too, had changed. The woman who had once walked away from James, the woman who had chosen to follow her own path, had found strength in her decision. But in this moment, she too was learning that growth didn't mean leaving the past behind. It meant embracing it, understanding it, and finding the courage to open your heart again. She had shown James the healing power of presence, the importance of showing up for those who needed you even when it wasn't easy. In the way she cared for Sophie, in the way she had quietly forgiven and understood, Charlotte had become the person James had always admired and loved, a woman who knew how to heal not just wounds but hearts. And for Sophie, The little girl who had unknowingly played a role in bringing them back together. There was an innocence in her belief that illness wasn't scary, if you understood why it was there, that sadness could be soothed by understanding, and that love was something that didn't always need to be explained. Her drawings, her words, and her presence had bridged the gap between two people who had once loved each other but lost their way. As they sat together sipping tea, James realized that hope for the future wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it. It was about acknowledging mistakes, growing from them, and knowing that even the deepest wounds could be healed with time and effort. The story that had once seemed like it was coming to an end, full of regret and loss, had shifted. It had become a story of new beginnings, of forgiveness, of understanding, and of the possibility that some connections, no matter how much time had passed, could always find their way back. In that moment, James felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The future no longer seemed uncertain or distant. It was full of possibility. Possibility to rebuild, to reconnect, and to love again. Second chances were not just about what they had lost, but about what they could still gain together. The road ahead was uncharted, but for the first time James believed it was a road worth traveling.